This is Europe, a continent where empires rose and fell. In the beginning, though, Europe was a forgettable landmass on a lush planet. As the Homo Sapiens moved from Africa, Europe witnessed remarkable progress. Soon, the continent would see legendary battles, genius philosophers, immortal architecture, powerful monarchies, and world domination. But how did the early settlements become the greatest civilizations humanity has ever seen? The people of Kirokitia on the modern-day island of Cyprus in 7000 BC changed the way of life of Europeans. They paved the way for agriculture. The settlement was surrounded by a defensive wall made of large stone blocks. The houses within the settlement were circular and built using a combination of stone and mud brick construction. The interior of the houses featured multiple rooms, indicating a level of sophistication in architectural planning. They lived off wheat, barley, lentils, and peas. Ultimately, the people of this ancient city spent their days creating food. While the need to feed yourself is crucial, early Europeans also found creating massive stone structures called megaliths equally important. From 4000 to 2000 BC, various megaliths appeared across the continent, like in modern-day County Clare in Ireland. Polnabron Dolmen is a large portal tomb with 3 standing stones holding it in place for thousands of years. Throughout all of the megaliths, one still captivates us today. In modern-day Salisbury, UK, lies the magnificent Stonehenge, a structure that was once the hub of civilization. We will never fully know the purpose of a structure like this. While Stonehenge was being built all the way on the other side of the continent, the first advanced European civilization was upon us. On the island of Crete, under the leadership of King Minos, the Minoan civilization became a hub for trade. The Egyptians, Phoenicians, and Mesopotamians met on the island of Crete. While exchanging goods, they also exchanged cultures and ideas with the Minoans. The Minoans took the ideas they'd learned from the other cultures. They created the roots of all European languages in a model known as Linear A. Their language was very similar to the Egyptians in a lot of ways, as it was based on various symbols, which can be used to create a variety of different meanings. Around 1600 BC, on the mainland of Greece, the Mycenaean civilization took the complex nature of Linear A and made it simpler, creating a language system of 87 distinct symbols. The Mycenaeans created their civilization based on the city-states. Each city would be ruled over by a warrior king, known as a wannix, who controlled the surrounding territories and maintained a hierarchical society. They relied on the support of aristocrats and nobles to govern their city-states effectively. The Mycenaean city-states engaged in diplomacy, trade, and occasional conflicts with one another and neighboring civilizations. They were not unified under a single Mycenaean state. Still, they existed as separate entities, each with ruling elite and administrative systems, creating influential cities and states, such as Mycenae with its massive Cyclopean walls, Pylos with its palace of nectar, and Sparta with its impressive military. Each of these cities and states would work independently until conflict strikes. While in modern-day Turkey, the city of Troy rose. Like its Mycenaean counterparts, it was an independent city-state that ruled its people without the help of any greater civilization, until the start of the Trojan War. Around the 13th and 12th centuries, the Prince of Troy, Paris, was invited to the realms of Sparta for a diplomatic mission by King Menelaus. Paris, though, didn't just come for trade. He came to steal King Menelaus's wife, Helen. Once Menelaus found out about the abduction, he called upon Mycenaean leaders to defend their oaths and loyalty against the enemy. The first time that many Europeans worked together and bonded against an enemy civilization. Upon reaching Troy, the Greeks besieged the city for 10 years. The Trojan defenses held firm against the Mycenaean onslaught. The Mycenaeans devised a plan to infiltrate Troy using a wooden horse, the famous Trojan horse. They built a massive wooden structure and hid a select group of warriors inside it. The rest of the Mycenaean fleet pretended to sail away, leaving the horse as an apparent victory trophy. The Trojans, unaware of the Mycenaeans' ruse, brought the horse within the walls of Troy. That night, the Greek warriors emerged from the horse, opened the city gates, and allowed the returning Greek forces to enter Troy. The city was sacked, and its inhabitants were either killed or enslaved. Though the historical accuracy of this story is highly questioned, as most of it was taken from Homer's literary masterpieces, the Odyssey and the Iliad. What the Trojan War did, though, is that it brought the idea that different city-states throughout Greece could work together in a sort of union against a collective bad. However, the Mycenaean city-states would begin to decline shortly after the Trojan War was allegedly fought, due to the struggles of internal conflicts and the occasional attacks from the mysterious Sea People. With the Mycenaeans out of the way, around 1100 BC, the naval warriors of the Phoenicians started to set up colonies across the continent. Their capital of Tyre was in modern-day Lebanon, across from Europe on the eastern side of the Mediterranean. From this position, they could send their naval forces to establish colonies all across Europe. From Malaga and Gadir in Spain to Modia and Lilybaeum in Sicily. They also began to ally with emerging Greek city-states such as Corinth, forging an intimidating power. Due to their extensive trade network, their alphabet of 22 letters spread across the European world. In 800 BC, the Greek continent was dark. The writing system of Linear B was utterly inactive. Literacy was on its way out, and invasions were non-stop. However, in modern-day Austria were the Celts, and the rise of the Hallstatt culture. During this era, iron, a superior and more accessible metal than bronze, came into widespread use. The mastery of ironworking techniques revolutionized weapons, tools, and other implements, enhancing the capabilities of the Celts in warfare, agriculture, and craftsmanship throughout Europe. The discovery of iron also had significant economic implications, as it facilitated trade and the development of complex regional networks throughout Europe. The Hallstatt culture was characterized by its rich burial customs, indicating social stratification and a growing sense of identity and prestige. Prominent members of society were interred in elaborate tombs, often accompanied by valuable grave goods. These burials showcased the wealth and status of the individuals and highlighted the emerging hierarchy within Celtic society. Trade was pivotal during this period, with the Celts establishing extensive European networks. The Hallstatt culture was a hub for exchanging goods, ideas, and cultural influences. They traded salt, a valuable commodity from local salt mines, and other resources like amber, metals, textiles, and luxury items. The Celts interacted with neighboring cultures through these networks, including the fledgling Greeks and the Etruscans. Initially, the Etruscans were just a small group of immigrants from Lydia and Asia Minor who ventured to mainland Italy. While the Greeks were struggling, the Etruscans were able to gain a foothold, creating strong city-states of Veii, Tarquinia, and Cerveteri. Though in Greece, the city-states were just little tiny polis. Initially, the term polis referred to a fortified area or citadel which offered protection during times of war. Because of these structures' relative safety, people flocked to them and set up communities and commercial centers. Over time, this polis started to attract people to move over toward them, which led to the rise of various city-states and colonies across the world. In the fertile area of Peloponnesia, Sparta was creating a city-state empire like no other. The legendary Spartans would come in and take over these villages, declaring themselves as the rulers and masters of the land. However, these newly conquered individuals weren't of equal status to the Spartans. Instead, they became helots. unfree laborers tied to the land and required to supply food to Sparta or face the wrath of the angry Spartans. In the eyes of Sparta, these helots were nothing but labor to feed the war machine of Sparta, creating a social hierarchy where Spartans were automatically considered superior to all others, the crux of European culture. Even in the great Athenian democracy, there was quite a strict distinction between the citizens and the non-citizens. In Athens, only around 10% of the population was able and willing to vote in any given election. To gain the right to vote, you must be an Athenian-born man over the age of 20 and completed his military service. You were not a citizen if you did not fall into this category. Your life was to support the fabric of the oligarchic democracy that was created. While Plato and Socrates spent their days studying rhetoric and voting, 9 other people had to do the jobs that no one remembers. European history is a rich man's game. So is the game of war. Around 550 BC, Cyrus I of the Persian Empire had enough of Greek colonization, especially in the regions around the Persian homeland. City after city fell to the might of the Persian army. The Ionian Greeks, despite their valiant efforts, found themselves outmatched by the sheer force and organizational prowess of their adversaries. In 499 BC, Darius I was determined to finish his father's business and conquer all of Greece. After hearing about the tyrannical rule of Persia, volunteers from every city-state came to Ionia to restore Greek power. Whether Athenian, Spartan, or Corinthian, they were all considered Greek. As the Greeks were able to dispel the Persians from Ionia, Darius was undeterred. All came to a head at the Battle of Marathon, where the Persian army stretched far and wide, seemingly invincible in their vast numbers. Despite the overwhelming size disadvantage, the Greek warriors stood resolute, fueled by their unwavering love for freedom and their determination to protect their homeland. With a battle cry that resonated through the air, the Greek soldiers charged forward, their phalanx formation presenting an impenetrable shield against the Persian onslaught. The hoplites, clad in bronze armor and wielding spears and shields, formed an unyielding wall of defense. The Persians, taken aback by the ferocity and discipline of the Greek soldiers, launched wave after wave of attacks. However, the Greek lines held firm, their coordinated movements repelling the Persian advance, causing the Persians to eventually retreat. With the Persians out of the picture, Greece was at its golden age. Born from this golden age was one of Greece's greatest gifts to Western civilization: philosophy. From the minds of the greatest thinkers in Ionia, Greek philosophy sought to make sense of the world around it through logic and reason, and can be split up into 3 key eras: early or pre-Socratic philosophy, classical philosophy, and the later Hellenistic philosophy. 6th century pre-Socratic Greek philosophy saw people like Thales of Miletus and the Milesian school attempt to answer questions about our origins as a species and our place in the universe. Others, like Pythagoras, attempted to reconcile a religion with logic and use the discipline of mathematics to begin answering questions about our universe. Fast forward to the 5th century, and we get to the classical age of Greek philosophy. Beginning with the birth of Socrates in 469 BC, philosophy changed from a pursuit of the purely metaphysical to one of social and political questioning. His methods were unusual, preferring to engage in dialogue and debate around the city of Athens as opposed to study and dictation, like his predecessors. As a result, Socrates never wrote any of his teachings down. Instead, everything we know about him comes from the writings of his pupils: Plato, Xenophon, and later Aristotle, all of which occurred decades after his death. His pupil Plato came from the generation of philosophers directly after Socrates and is famous for inventing the written dialogue, dialectic form of philosophy, and for his theory of forms. He wrote a number of stories and plays about his former teacher, many of which act as our only existing sources of the ancient philosopher and his beliefs. Plato lived to 80 years old, creating a school in Athens for future philosophers. Aristotle came much after, moving to Athens and enrolling in Plato's school of philosophy as a young man. Unlike Plato, Aristotle preferred to take a more practical view of philosophy, using it to benefit society and the lives of the common man, as opposed to seeking an answer to life's biggest questions. He would soon be invited to Macedonia to tutor a young prince named Alexander, teachings that would prove to be eternal. Much later, you had Hellenistic philosophers who were influenced by the new cultural identities of the Greco-Roman world. Movements like Stoicism and Epicureanism began around this time and revolved around the role of the individual and how philosophy could be used to better someone's own life. After the war, the playwright Aeschylus wrote the earliest Greek play that survived, The Persians, performed at the theater of Dionysus. Though the play was pro-Greek, it could still shine a light on the cost of war. As Aeschylus writes in this early work, "A world of wealth is trash if men are wanting. Men who have no wealth never find fortune smiling as their strength deserves." The men on both sides of this war gave up so much. How will we create a world where these warriors are not wanted anymore? The orator and politician Pericles felt he had the answer to Aeschylus's problem. He believed in the importance of education, making Athens a center for philosophical and intellectual pursuits, while also saying that each citizen should have a say in the government through democracy. However, all periods of enlightenment must come to an end. The men are always wanting. There must be war yet again. This time, though, it was between former allies Athens and Sparta. Athens emerged as a dominant naval power, while Sparta boasted an unparalleled land-based military. In 431 BC, tensions between Athens and Spartan ally Corinth were boiling. Corinth had been seeking support from other Greek states to challenge Athens' regional dominance. A dispute over the city of Corcyra, modern-day Corfu, became the spark that ignited the conflict. Corinth had a long-standing rivalry with Corcyra and sought to recruit Athens' assistance to bring the city under control. However, Athens decided to side with Corcyra, which infuriated Corinth and its Spartan allies. Seeing Athens' interference as a threat to its leadership, Sparta called for a meeting of its allies to discuss the growing Athenian power. Many of the city-states, resentful of Athens' dominance, rallied behind Sparta. Fearful of potential Spartan aggression, Athens fortified its city walls, relying on its naval strength to protect it from a direct assault. Thus, in 431 BC, the Peloponnesian War began. The conflict pitted Athens' naval supremacy and empire against Sparta's formidable land-based army and Peloponnesian League allies. The war would last for almost 3 decades, ravaging Greek lands, causing immense suffering, and forever changing the balance of power in the region. As the years turned into decades, battles occurred in Sybota, Potidaea, and Delium, leaving countless dead. Then, after being put under siege by Spartan general Lysander, the Athenians decided to surrender by the summer of 404 BC, hence leading to the end of the Grecian dominance in the European world. In unity they thrive, but in conflict they fall. While on the mainland of the continent, the Celts were expanding. In the Isle of Ireland in Britain, the tribes such as the Gaels, the Britons, and the Picts started to take hold. The land of the Gaul, modern-day France, and the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain, became an assortment of different cultures, telling different stories of myths and legends. When in 336 BC, Alexander the Great took power. He wasn't interested in the Celts above, he wanted absolute control of Greece. So when the Greek city of Thebes decided to revolt, Alexander and his army marched 240 miles in 14 days. When Thebes refused to surrender, he razed the entire city to the ground, and 6,000 were killed, and the rest were sold into slavery. He continued his campaign across the Persian Empire to Issus, Gaugamela, and eventually Babylon with the same force. Alexander was on the warpath. Then in 323 BC, Alexander's campaign was done. He lay dead in the former Persian capital of Babylon, leaving Europe with no guidance on where to go. It would have seemed to many at the time of Alexander's conquests that the vast world in which they lived was beginning to shrink rapidly. Where empires marched, they brought with them trade, and improved road networks that linked east and west for the first time in centuries. Maps of the ancient world were surprisingly detailed for the time, with many key landmarks and geographical features present in their drawings. You had the work of Herodotus of Halicarnassus in 425 BC, who traveled much of the ancient world, recording what he saw and compiling it into his book, The Histories. A reconstructed map of the world based on Herodotus's writings showed just how extensive his travels and understanding of the local geography really were. A century later, Greek geographer Pytheas of Massilia conducted his own explorations into northern Europe and beyond. He circumnavigated both Ireland and Great Britain, writing extensively about both before continuing his journey north into a land of eternal darkness and constant snow. He was the first scientific thinker to record the existence of the Arctic and polar ice, and is also believed to have been the first Greek to make contact with the Celtic and Germanic tribes of northwestern Europe. He wrote about a midnight sun and attempted to explain the phenomenon of shorter days and longer nights as he traveled further and further away from the Mediterranean. His voyage of 330 BC and the subsequent writings he produced were highly regarded during antiquity, and would have no doubt furnished the libraries of every great thinker of the time. Despite this, though, no original sources survive into the modern era, and what we know comes from snippets and references from other writers centuries later. Pytheas embarked on his journey just 5 years before the death of Alexander the Great. But when he returned to the Mediterranean, many of the old empires he once knew were gone, soon to be replaced by bigger and better things. Rome wasn't built in a day, it was built in 3 centuries. In the beginning, Rome was just a tiny republic. Nothing of extraordinary grandeur, just another place where people lived and fought for status. It was considered part of your Roman duty to provide your own equipment and weapons, which led to only the rich being able to ascend to the ranks of the legion, while the poor citizens of Rome served in the military as velites or skirmishers. Velites were armed with light-throwing weapons and a small shield. They were just lamb for the slaughter. Roman general and consul Publius Cornelius Rufinus decided to take the coveted Campania region from the Samnites. Rome, ever ambitious, stood in their path, determined to expand its control. Battle after battle ensued, and at that moment, Rome thought they were getting the upper hand. The Samnites, rallying their allies and neighboring tribes, challenged Rome's expansionist ambitions. They were quickly dealt with. In 280 BC, the Greek kingdom of Epirus under King Pyrrhus tried to conquer Rome, but quickly retreated out of the Italian peninsula. Then came the Punic Wars, a series of conflicts between Rome and Carthage, a powerful maritime empire in North Africa. These wars were primarily fought for control over Sicily and dominance in the western Mediterranean. Rome emerged victorious, destroying Carthage and establishing itself as the dominant power in the Mediterranean. No one was left to stop the Romans except for the Romans themselves. All was good in Rome until 107 BC, when Roman general Gaius Marius introduced a series of reforms to the military aptly named the Marian Reforms, in which he shifted the loyalty from the state to the general. A simple soldier no longer had to follow the whims of the Roman Senate. You only had to listen to your generals. And yes, the general didn't have to agree with whatever the Roman Senate would say. In 83 BC, General Lucius Cornelius Sulla took his army of soldiers to Rome and declared war. Sulla felt the reforms Marius gave were tyrannical, so he and his army sought to overturn them. So Sulla killed Marius and declared himself to be the dictator of Rome, hoping to restore the Senate and the former glory of Rome. He was afraid of the popular assemblies which he viewed as breeding grounds for unrest. Despite his military strength and reforms to the Roman Empire, Sulla resigned in 79 BC and returned to private life. Little did Sulla know at the time, his reforms led to a bloodier change in the Roman Empire. While in the land of the Gauls, tribal alliances and noble kings reigned supreme. Each tribe had its own chieftain, a guardian of their ancestral lands, and a symbol of their collective strength. The Gauls, fierce and valiant warriors, wielded long swords and spears clad in shimmering chainmail and adorned helmets that reflected their individuality. The Gauls were not merely warriors and farmers, their souls were woven with threads of mysticism and reverence for the divine. The wise and revered Druids held court in sacred groves over rituals and ceremonies. The Druids, intermediaries between the ethereal and the earthly, guided the Gaulish people, dispensing wisdom, healing, and justice. Though, according to the Romans, they were just mere barbarians. They didn't follow the Roman ideals of decorum. They didn't share the same culture. They were just different. While back in Rome, the broke Julius Caesar was elected to be the esteemed Pontifex Maximus of Rome. However, his expensive campaign left him deeply in debt. So, Caesar had a lot of power with no money. Caesar did what any debt-ridden influential person would: go to war with the Gauls. The Gallic Wars, spanning 8 long years from 58 BC to 50 BC, became a crucible of bloodshed, strategy, and unwavering determination. With his unparalleled military genius, Caesar unleashed his legions like a thunderstorm upon the unsuspecting tribes of Gaul. His first challenge came from the Helvetii, a formidable Gallic tribe who sought to migrate to new lands. Caesar confronted them with steely resolve, seeing an opportunity to exert his power. The clash was fierce, but Caesar's disciplined legions proved superior. In a resounding victory, he shattered the Helvetii's dreams of expansion and brought them under his control. Emboldened by his triumph, Caesar turned his gaze toward the powerful Nervi, a fierce tribe known for their martial prowess. The battle that ensued was a titanic clash of swords and shields, a whirlwind of bravery and desperation. Against all odds, Caesar's legions emerged victorious, their unwavering discipline and strategic acumen prevailing over the Nervi's fearless ferocity. The Arverni, a proud and mighty tribe, stood as a formidable obstacle in Caesar's path. Led by the charismatic and courageous chieftain Vercingetorix, they rallied numerous tribes in a desperate bid to drive out the invader. The land shook as the Roman legions clashed with the united Gaulish forces in the siege of Alesia. Surrounded by fortifications and facing an army that outnumbered his own, Caesar orchestrated a daring plan. His legions encircled the Gaulish stronghold, cutting off any hope of escape. The battleground trembled as the Roman war machine relentlessly pounded the walls of Alesia. Through months of relentless siege, Caesar's resolve remained unyielding. The Gauls fought with a desperation born from their love for their homeland. Still, against the disciplined might of Rome, their resistance faltered. In a pivotal moment, Vercingetorix, realizing the futility of further struggle, surrendered to Caesar. His sword laid at the feet of the conqueror. Vercingetorix was taken as a prisoner to Rome and paraded through the streets as part of Caesar's triumph. He was imprisoned for 6 years before being publicly executed in 46 BC, marking the end of the Gallic resistance against Rome. Though the Roman Senate was against the power Caesar was grasping, the chants of "Hail Caesar" made his rise unstoppable. Following the way of Sulla and Marius before him, the Senate was weak, and General Julius was now the emperor. As one may rise, one may fall, because on a dreaded day in March 44 BC, Caesar entered the Senate house, and the conspirators surrounded him, feigning support and loyalty. At that moment, one of the conspirators, Gaius Servilius Casca, struck the first blow, followed by a barrage of dagger thrusts from Brutus and the other senators. Caesar did not flee or beg for mercy despite being surrounded and attacked. He resisted his assailants, attempting to defend himself, but ultimately succumbed to his injuries. In his final breaths, Julius Caesar uttered his famous last words, "Et tu, Brute?" meaning, "You too, Brutus?" After Caesar. Amidst the turmoil, a young and ambitious figure emerged from the shadows. Gaius Octavius, Caesar's adopted son, possessed a burning desire to claim his rightful place as the heir to Caesar's legacy. Determined to avenge his adopted father's death, he forged an alliance with a formidable general, Mark Antony, and the seasoned politician Lepidus, birthing a triumvirate that would shake the foundations of Rome. However, Octavian and Antony were short friends, as in 31 BC, Octavian killed Antony at the Battle of Actium, leaving for Octavian to usurp the title of Augustus, meaning the revered or the illustrious, allowing the newly named Augustus to be the first emperor of Rome. During Augustus's reign, Rome experienced a wave of relative peace and stability known as the Pax Romana. For 200 years, Rome would be a land of imperial achievement. With their massive territory, Roman influence was everywhere, even in Bethlehem, the land where the Christian Messiah, Jesus, was born. The life of Jesus is one of mythic proportions. However, it is one that saw him perish on the cross under Emperor Tiberius Caesar, creating a deep divide in the Roman Empire. Was the crucified man really the Messiah? A question the Romans did not have an answer to. In 43 AD, the Roman Empire, under the leadership of Emperor Claudius, invaded Britannia and established Roman rule over the peninsula. To maintain control, the Romans imposed heavy taxes on the native tribes, often subjecting them to harsh treatment and confiscating their lands. When King Pristougus of the Iceni tribe died, the Romans disregarded his will and took all the land for themselves, torturing his daughters and his wife, Queen Boudica. In the year 60, Boudica commanded an army of 100,000 warriors to revolt against the Romans. After, they took over the Roman cities of Londinium and Verulamium. So Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus led his army to a land near modern-day Birmingham where a final confrontation would take place. Despite being vastly outnumbered, Suetonius positioned his troops strategically and professionally. As Boudica's forces charged the Roman lines, the disciplined Romans held their ground and formed a tight defensive formation. The rebels found breaking through the Roman ranks impossible. Suetonius's troops managed to withstand the initial onslaught and gradually pushed back the rebel forces, resulting in the death of around 80,000 rebels compared to the 400 Roman casualties. Boudica killed herself shortly after. However, the Pax Romana in the city of Rome was still going strong. In 72, under Emperor Vespasian, the construction of the Roman Colosseum began. The amphitheater was an immense structure, utilizing advanced engineering techniques. It was built using a combination of concrete, stone, and brick, with travertine limestone used for the outer facade. The Colosseum consisted of 4 stories, reaching a height of approximately 48 meters, 157 feet. Under the rule of Emperor Trajan, the Roman Empire was able to expand to its greatest territorial extent, spanning all the way from modern-day Britain to the Persian Gulf. Roman rule was everywhere. When Trajan died, Emperor Hadrian was poised with a near-impossible task of keeping Rome together. In Roman Britannica, he built the elusive Hadrian's Wall, while back in Rome, he built the magnificent Pantheon. Though as the Pax Romana continued, it seemed that the Roman Empire could go on forever. That would not be the case though, as historian Edward Gibbon wrote in his historical classic, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. This long peace and the uniform government of the Romans introduced a slow and secret poison into the vitals of the empire. The minds of men were gradually reduced to the same level. The fire of genius was extinguished, and even the military spirit evaporated. They received laws and governors from the will of their sovereign and trusted for their defense to a mercenary army. The Roman Empire lost its spark. It was just another place to live. In 284 AD, Emperor Diocletian faced a significant problem. Rome was becoming more and more bureaucratic. Diocletian created a tetrarchy that appointed 4 different emperors. Though this separation may seem helpful, it just led for bureaucratic struggles of which emperors should have more power. However, according to Christianity, it was Jesus who saved it. During a time of questioning, Emperor Constantine received a sign in the sky from the Christian God, with the words, "In this sign, conquer," followed by the image of a cross. Presuming it to be God's will, Constantine led his army against fellow Roman Emperor Maxentius in the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Constantine easily won the battle and, in 313, pronounced the Edict of Milan. 313 years after the crucifixion of Christ, Christianity was not only accepted, but rather the official religion of the Roman Empire. Constantine was baptized as a Christian on his deathbed. While the Romans were enlightened with the way of Christ, the Huns, on the other hand, were on a blood quest. In the late 4th century, the Huns left their homeland of Central Asia to pillage Europe. Their targets were the Gothic civilizations of Germany, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, and the Gepids. Some chose to fight the Huns and lose, others decided to seek refuge in Rome. Rome is safe, Rome is secure, and Rome is united. Roman Emperor Theodosius was steadfast in keeping the Huns at bay, so the Goths came for safety. However, in 395, Theodosius died and decided to split up the empire. Arcadius would inherit eastern Rome, while Honorius inherited western Rome. In the weaker western Rome, King Alaric of the Visigoths stood at the precipice of his greatest ambition, Rome. In the heart of a fateful night on the 24th of August, 410, the Visigoths unleashed their fury. The gates of Rome crumbled before the relentless tide. As a storm unleashed, Alaric and his warriors surged through the breach, their battle cries reverberating through the moonlit streets. Once thought impenetrable, Rome trembled in the wake of the Visigothic onslaught. The city that had stood for 800 years, a symbol of grandeur and might, now bore witness to the wrath of those long scorned. Palaces and temples fell before the Visigothic fury, their treasures seized by the triumphant warriors. Yet amidst the chaos, Alaric's voice of reason resounded, urging his warriors to spare the innocent and respect Christian church's sanctity. As the fires of Rome dwindled, Alaric and his warriors departed, their mission accomplished, forever leaving it to bear the scars of that fateful raid. The Visigoths conquered Rome, but were unable to hold it. While the prospects of existence weren't so much better in eastern Rome, the notorious Attila the Hun gained power through torture and violence. Attila and his army stormed through the Balkans and the Danubian frontier, killing and ransacking all the way to the well-fortified city of Constantinople. However, due to Constantinople's high walls, Attila couldn't conquer it. Instead, he reached a peace treaty in which he would leave Constantinople alone, in exchange for an annual tribute of 2,100 pounds of gold, a staggering sum. After Constantinople, Attila had Rome in sight. Attila met Pope Leo I, an emissary between the Huns and Rome. According to Christian legend, the apparitions of St. Paul and St. Peter appeared to Attila. They threatened to kill him if he didn't negotiate with Pope Leo I. After this mystical meeting, Attila decided to pull out of Italy and return to the Great Hungarian Plain. Whether because of his fear of the Pope and his saintly allies, or because his troops were stretched too thin and weakened by malaria, is still unknown, leading to the eventual end of the Hunnic Empire. Things weren't looking much better in Western Rome. In 476 AD, a powerful Germanic chieftain named Odoacer overthrew the small remnants of the Roman Empire. Unlike the past tyrants, Odoacer chose not to don the purple cloak of the Roman emperors, but instead declared himself king of Italy. Yet Odoacer's reign was not unchallenged. A new power was rising across the Adriatic Sea and the rugged Balkans. Theodoric the Great, king of the Ostrogoths, was amassing an army. his eyes fixed on the Italian peninsula. Encouraged by the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno, who feared Theodoric's might, the Ostrogothic king led his people on a westward march. Thus, in 489 AD, the tides of destiny carried the Ostrogoths to Italy. A clash of titans ensued, a 5-year war that saw two great powers struggle for dominance. But destiny had already chosen its champion. In 493 AD, Theodoric, the Ostrogothic king, finally overpowered Odoacer. In a banquet intended for peace, Theodoric unsheathed his sword, and with a swift stroke, ended Odoacer's reign and life. The victor Theodoric sat on the throne as the king of Italy. But unlike the conquerors of old, he did not ravage and ruin. Instead, he sought harmony, coexistence, and the preservation of Roman traditions. The laws of Rome were respected, its citizens were treated with dignity, and a sense of peace and prosperity filled the air. Christianity wasn't just a tool of the Romans, it was infiltrating Europe. Many leaders were skeptical, not knowing what to make of this new god. Clovis I from the Frankish kingdom took a page from Constantine's playbook, and in the Battle of Tobiac in 496 against the Alemanni, Clovis prayed to the Christian god and promised if he won the war, he would convert to Christianity. The Franks easily won the battle, and Clovis kept his promise by converting himself and his country to Catholicism. Though they may have believed in the same god, Byzantium had a different interpretation. Justinian I decided to rebrand Eastern Rome from the legacy of Rome and created the new empire of Byzantium. Under Justinian's rule, the Byzantine Empire underwent a process of reconquest and expansion. His most famous military commander, Belisarius, led successful campaigns to reclaim lost territories in the west. The most significant achievement was the reconquest of parts of Italy and North Africa, temporarily reuniting the Roman Empire under Byzantine rule. In addition to military and legal reforms, Justinian was involved in architectural projects. He sponsored the construction of numerous impressive buildings, including the famous Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. This grand cathedral, renowned for its stunning architecture and intricate mosaics, symbolized Byzantine power and Christian piety. While back in Italy in 568, the Germanic tribe of the Lombards under King Albion invaded Italy. The Lombards gradually carved out their kingdom through a series of strategic campaigns. They captured cities and strongholds, established duchies, and extended their control over vast northern and central Italy. The Lombard kingdom became a powerful political entity in the region, with Pavia as its capital. However, it is essential to note that the Lombards did not wholly eradicate the existing Roman and Byzantine structures. They incorporated Roman governance and administration elements into their system, blending Germanic and Roman traditions. The Lombard kings allowed Roman aristocrats to retain some of their lands and privileges, seeking to stabilize their rule and ensure the productivity of the land. However, Jesus wasn't the only prophet anymore. In the lands of the Middle East, a prophet named Muhammad founded the religion of Islam. Under the will of their prophet, they've all set their eyes on Europe. General Tariq ibn Ziyad of the Umayyad Caliphate led an expedition across the Strait of Gibraltar, landing in southern Hispania with an army of Berber and Arab soldiers. The Visigothic kingdom, weakened by internal divisions and a succession crisis, was ill-prepared to face the disciplined and well-organized Muslim forces. Tariq ibn Ziyad swiftly advanced, encountering little resistance from the disunited Visigothic nobility. In the Battle of Guadalete, Tariq ibn Ziyad led his forces against the Visigothic army commanded by King Roderick. The battle proved a decisive turning point, resulting in a resounding victory for the Muslim forces. King Roderick was killed in the battle, further destabilizing the Visigothic leadership and creating the beginning of an Islamic Spain. The Lombards, though, were tired of the excellent control of the papacy. Being threatened by military action, Pope Stephen II pleaded with Frankish King Pepin the Short for military aid against the Lombards. Motivated by his ambitions and the desire to strengthen the Frankish influence in Italy, Pepin agreed to support the papacy's cause. In 754, Pepin led a Frankish army into Italy, launching a military campaign against the Lombards. The war between the Franks and the Lombards lasted for several years. Pepin's forces confronted the Lombards in numerous battles, gradually pushing them back and weakening their hold over the Italian territories. The decisive battle occurred at Pavia, the Lombard capital, where the Frankish army achieved a significant victory, leading to the demise of the Lombards. Feeling generous, Pepin the Short gave the papacy a small subsection of land, now known as Vatican City. This act solidified the alliance between the Franks and the papacy. This allowed King Charlemagne, who ascended the throne in 768, with the papal support of the ideals of reuniting Western Rome. Through a series of military campaigns, he expanded the Frankish kingdom, incorporating territories that spanned modern-day France, Germany, Italy, and parts of other European countries. His military successes earned him the title of Emperor of the Carolingian Empire. This realm encompassed much of Western Europe. In 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as the Holy Roman Emperor, and his empire was named the Holy Roman Empire. After Charlemagne's death, his son Louis the Pious inherited the empire. As his name suggests, he was very pious, but could not do anything when the Vikings began raids along the Rhine River, causing fear among the public. Why would anyone respect a leader who couldn't keep them safe? So Europeans started to create a system of feudalism in which they relied on the central government for defense, and landowning nobles started to enlist knights and vassals to protect their lands. These lands were worked by serfs, who were tied to their land. The serfs' sole responsibility was to make enough food to feed themselves and the knights, nobles, and kings. Of course, 90% of the population during the feudal eras were serfs, because producing food back then was a labor-intensive grind. After Louis the Pious died in 840, so did the Charlemagne Empire. Just like in the Roman Empire, infighting with the family caused them to split the empire in three ways. In the west, Charles the Bald oversaw France. In the east, Louis the German settled the lands of Germany. While in the middle, Lothair was given a middle kingdom that fell instantly, like a house of cards. As the Holy Roman Empire was dividing, the Vikings attacked all across the coasts of Europe. The Vikings pillaged, and pillaged. Then, in 911, King Charles the Simple sought to end the Viking attacks and forge a peaceful relationship with the Vikings in the region. Under the treaty's terms, King Charles granted the Viking leader Rollo the territory of Normandy, which consisted of lands along the northern coast of France. In exchange for the land, Rollo agreed to end his Viking raids and pledge his loyalty to the Frankish king. Rollo also agreed to convert to Christianity and was baptized in the treaty. For the first time, the Vikings had a permanent home and a legitimate position within the feudal system. They transitioned from raiders and invaders to landowners and rulers, adopting the customs and language of the region. Though this treaty didn't stop the Vikings from attacking the British Isles. This led King Athelstan of Essex to gain troops from the rest of the Isles to protect them from the incoming Vikings, led by Olaf Gottfridsson of Norse Dublin. As Athelstan won the battle, he united England, making him to be the first king of a united England, and so began one of the longest monarchies in history. While in the East Frankish kingdom, Otto I wanted to follow in the quest of Charlemagne and create a united Rome once again. In the Battle of Lechfeld of 955, Otto beat the pagan Magyars. Then in 961, he led an army to Italy, recapturing land from all of the pagan kingdoms. Then in 962, Otto I was coronated to Pope John XII in Rome as the new Holy Roman Emperor. In 987, the West Frankish kingdom was on the verge of turmoil. King Louis V died at age 20 without leaving an heir to take over their dynasty, leaving the French monarchy in peril. So, the French aristocracy had an election between Hugh Capet, a noble with extensive lands in the region of Isle-de-France, and Charles, Duke of Lower Lorraine. Through Capet's marital ties and high-powered friends, Hugh won the election and became France's first king. While the word of Christ was going strong, the beliefs in France and the Holy Roman Empire were utterly different from the ones in Byzantine. They argued over the role of the Pope, what language the Bible should be spoken in, and where the power of religion should lie. In 1054, the division became too big. Papal Legate Humbert of Silva, Canada, representing Pope Leo IX, excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael I Cerularius. In response, Cerularius excommunicated the legate and his associates. This led to a permanent split between the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholic Church. In January 1066, English King Edward the Confessor died without a natural heir. So they crowned Harold Godwinson, the mighty Earl of Wessex, to be king. The only problem, King Edward had already promised it to a man nicknamed William the Bastard from Normandy. When William saw Harold's coronation, he gathered an army and set sail for England. He landed at Pevensey in Sussex and built a fortified camp. Realizing the imminent threat, Harold and his tired troops marched south to face the Normans. On October 14, 1066, the decisive Battle of Hastings occurred in Sussex. The battle was intense, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Ultimately, Harold was killed, likely by an arrow to the eye, and his forces were defeated. William the Bastard was crowned King of England on Christmas Day 1066, thus establishing Norman rule over England, which caused William to gain the name William the Conqueror, a much more terrifying name than a bastard. While over in non-Europe, the Seljuk Turks took over Jerusalem, pledging the holy city for the Islamic faith and kicking out the Christians. So in 1095, Pope Urban declared that all good Christians must take over Jerusalem's lands. So people across Europe, from France, Italy, Holy Roman Empire, Barcelona, and Constantinople, all came together, and with their collective forces, went to Europe to take over Jerusalem. So in 1099, the Christian forces took over Jerusalem, making it a Christian land again, showing the strength of a united Europe. Of course, 50 years later, the Turks retook Jerusalem. So came the Second Crusade under the leadership of King Louis VII, which failed. King Louis was captured, and most of his army was dead. Then in 1187 came the Third Crusade, when King Richard I of Britain, Emperor Frederick I of the Holy Roman Empire, and King Philip II of France tried the holy city of Jerusalem. Richard was captured, Frederick died, and Philip just left, leaving the Third to be a disaster. Then in 1202, the Fourth Crusade began with the intention of recapturing Jerusalem, but instead they attacked Constantinople. If you hate Constantinople, then the Fourth Crusade was a success. If the goal was to take over Jerusalem, then they failed miserably. While back in England, King John was notorious for his arbitrary rule, heavy taxation, and disregard for the rights and privileges of his subjects, particularly the nobility. As discontent simmered among the barons, a group of rebel leaders, led by the brave and resolute Robert Fitzwater, decided it was time to take a stand against the tyrannical king. With the threat of being killed, King John and Robert Fitzwater began creating a list of rights that everyone would have no matter what. This negotiation period in the summer of 1215 led to the first document to fully captivate your human rights, the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta guarantees that no new taxes unless a common council agrees. All free men have the right to justice and a fair trial with a jury. The monarch doesn't have absolute power. The law is above all men and applies to everyone equally. The Magna Carta was one of the first documents that gave individuals fundamental human rights. Before it, rights were nothing more than what your social class gave you. Now, even the monarch is under the same set of laws as a peasant. As England gave people rights, Europe went through not one but 4 more crusades. And guess what? They've all ended in failure. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing repeatedly and expecting a different result. The Crusades were definitely insane. As a direct result of the Crusades, Europe soon found herself in a vulnerable position. Their best armies were busy fighting in the Middle East, leaving much of the European countryside defenseless and without its best commanders. Also, the kingdoms of Central Europe had become fragmented and splintered as the Catholic Church attempted to wage war against the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. This meant that in 1223, Europe stood largely ununited, undefended, and unprepared for what was coming. The sound of 1,000 horses rumbled in the distance. The Golden Horde had reached Europe. The Mongol invasion of Europe began with the arrival of Mongol troops near modern-day Mariupol in Ukraine. They were victorious at the Battle of Kalka River in 1223, but halted their advance. They would spend the next 2 decades razing Russian and Ukrainian villages while establishing a sphere of influence over the area. In 1240, the Mongols sacked their first major European city, Kiev, beginning their invasion of Central Europe in earnest. The armies of Khadan and Batu Khan, 2 grandsons of Genghis Khan, launched a 2-pronged attack into modern-day Poland. They defeated a combined European army at the Battle of Legnica in 1241, and then crushed a Hungarian force at the Battle of Mohi just a few months later. The horde continued to push further into Central Europe, razing villages in Saxony, Bohemia, and Moravia as they went. Croatia, Austria, and Bulgaria all faced the wrath of the Khans and their nomadic soldiers before the year was over. But unlike in Asia, the Mongols were unsuccessful in exerting any real influence over the region. While they mounted raids, burned villages, defeated armies, and looted at will, they never overthrew any regimes or held power in any discernible way. They also never overthrew any major city, as European defenses were able to repel the Mongols on a number of occasions. Mongolian control was almost exclusively consigned to the sparsely populated countryside, and not much else. By the winter of 1241, the Mongol horde would begin its withdrawal from Europe, and made their long ride back to Mongolia. Historians don't agree on what exactly spurred this decision, but a leading theory points to the death of Genghis Khan's 3rd son, the Great Ogode Khan. Mongolian tradition dictates that all the princes of the blood who led the Mongolian armies were required to be present for the election of the next great Khan, and so they returned to honor their birthright, leaving Europe. For now, Europe was safe, but without a common enemy to unite them, the kingdoms of Europe fell right back to doing what it did best: waging war against one another. Issues with bureaucracy and who should take over the crown still weren't over in 1337, as the last direct descendant of Charlemagne, King Charles V, died without an heir. 2 candidates for who should be the next king emerged and demanded the throne: King Edward of England and Philip VI. King Edward argued that he was the next closest relative because all the royals were obsessed with Charlemagne. However, King Philip IV saw this as an insult to French sovereignty. Since Philip was closer to the paternal side, he declared himself to be a righteous king. The French coronated Philip because they didn't want the English king to rule over them. So, Edward led his forces from England to France and began a 100-year war. Just as the 100 Years' War began, a nasty disease called the Black Death emerged. The Black Death, or bubonic plague, caused painful swellings called buboes that appeared all over the victims' bodies. The disease was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which was spread by fleas that infested rats. Around 75 to 200 million people died, leaving Europe in a dark age. Farms were left uncultivated, economic systems collapsed, and trade was practically non-existent. The persistent presence of death influenced art, literature, and religious beliefs. Grim depictions of skeletons, danse macabre, and memento mori became prevalent, serving as reminders of life's transience. The plague also spurred a spiritual and existential crisis, with people questioning their faith and seeking answers through religious practices and sincere devotion. However, the plague inadvertently brought about some positive changes amidst the darkness. The reduced population led to increased social mobility for those who survived, as labor became scarce and demand for skilled workers rose. The devastation also paved the way for advancements in medicine and public health practices, as people sought to understand and combat the disease. In times of darkness, there is always a light, but before there can be a light, wars must be fought. Under the banner of Edward III, the English forces embarked on a bold campaign, determined to seize the French crown. Their first taste of victory came at the Battle of Crécy, where English longbowmen unleashed a storm of arrows upon the French knights, securing a resounding triumph. Encouraged by this early success, the English pressed on, their sights set on the glittering prize of Paris. But France would not yield easily. Led by the courageous Philip VI and later his son John II, the French forces rallied to defend their homeland. At the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, the tide turned in favor of the English once more. The indomitable Black Prince, Edward's son, captured John II, leaving the French king a captive in his enemy's hands. With the famous Battle of Agincourt in 1415, the English achieved a glorious triumph against overwhelming odds. The young king seemed destined to rule both kingdoms as he married Catherine of Valois and signed the Treaty of Troyes, securing his claim to the French throne. But hope never fades in the hearts of the oppressed. Inspired by her religious visions and a burning sense of patriotism, a simple peasant girl named Joan emerged as a beacon of hope for France. Joan of Arc, clad in armor and wielding a banner of courage, led the French forces to remarkable victories. Her determination and unwavering faith breathed new life into the downtrodden French. The French recaptured city after city with Joan's guidance, including the legendary Orléans. However, Joan's life was short-lived because in 1430 she was captured by the British and executed for being a witch. Finally, in 1453, the curtain fell on this long and bloody chapter. The Battle of Castillon climaxed the Hundred Years' War as the French delivered a final, resounding blow to the retreating English. The war-weary land of France celebrated its hard-fought victory, reclaiming its territories and identity. 1453 was a big year for wars on the European continent. In Asia, the Ottoman Turks were gearing up to take over the declining Byzantine Empire and the famous city of Constantinople. Sultan Mehmed II led an army of 80,000 soldiers, including elite Janissary troops and a powerful artillery force, to besiege Constantinople. The Byzantine defenders, led by Emperor Constantine XI, were faced with a nearly impossible task: holding off the Ottoman assault. The Ottomans bombarded the city with artillery for nearly 2 months, gradually destroying the wall. Then, on the fateful day of May 29, 1453, the Ottomans climbed up the wall and infiltrated Constantinople, causing the end of the Byzantine Empire. In 1453, all paths no longer led to Rome, and all trace back to the empire of Caesar was erased. But even though the face of Europe was changing, the continent's domination was still to come. In 1492, Christopher Columbus arrived in the Bahamas, and in 1498, Vasco da Gama reached the port of Calicut, India. Europe was now a truly global continent. Then the light came. The Renaissance and an era of rebirth were upon us. In Florence, Italy, a young artist named Leonardo da Vinci emerged from humble beginnings. Blessed with a keen eye and insatiable curiosity, Leonardo delved into every field imaginable: painting, sculpture, anatomy, engineering, and more. With his brush, he brought the Mona Lisa's enigmatic smile to life, capturing her essence for all of eternity. He dissected the human body keenly, unlocking secrets hidden beneath the skin. Leonardo was a Renaissance man embodying the spirit of boundless creativity and intellectual pursuit. Not far away, in the ethereal city of Rome, Michelangelo Buonarroti chiseled away at blocks of marble, coaxing out sculptures of breathtaking beauty. His masterpiece, the awe-inspiring David, stood tall and proud, symbolizing strength and resilience. Michelangelo's frescoes adorned the Sistine Chapel, where his brushstrokes transformed the ceiling into a celestial realm, teeming with divine figures and biblical stories. His art reflected a harmonious blend of technical skill and emotional depth, embodying the essence of the Renaissance spirit. Meanwhile, in the bustling city of Venice, the Venetian master Titian applied bold and vibrant colors to his canvases, creating vivid portraits and landscapes that captured the imagination. His mastery of color and light breathed life into his subjects, infusing them with a sense of vitality that radiated from the canvas. Titian's art resonated with the viewer's emotions, evoking a deep connection to the human experience. The thirst for knowledge and scientific understanding grew as the Renaissance swept Europe. In the small Polish town of Torun, Nicholas Copernicus peered into the night sky and dared to question the prevailing wisdom. Through careful observation and mathematical calculations, Copernicus proposed a revolutionary idea: the Earth revolved around the Sun. His heliocentric model challenged centuries of belief and laid the foundation for our modern understanding of the universe. However, one Renaissance thinker changed the political landscape of Europe. In 1517, Martin Luther famously posted the 95 Theses on a church in Wittenberg, Germany. Luther's essay had two main ideas. One, the Bible is the central religious authority, and two, humans may reach salvation only by their faith and not by their deeds. This mere idea changed how individuals viewed religion. Minor gentry and impoverished agricultural workers saw Protestantism as a way of addressing the social issues caused by the Catholic Church. Back in the time of Luther, being a Catholic was a pay-to-win game. If you pay an indulgence to the church, all your sins will be immediately forgiven. However, if we're all equal in the eyes of God, why should forgiveness be cost-based? Couldn't a peasant be forgiven too? This caused a revolt to spread quickly across different regions of Germany, with peasants forming armed bands and demanding their rights. However, the war came to a quick end when the Catholic forces were able to slaughter the poorly armed peasants. More than 80,000 people died in a war to find God. However, religious freedom is much easier when you're a king. In 1534, King Henry VIII saw an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. However, Pope Clement VIII refused, so King Henry VIII created his own church, the Anglican Church, so he can get as many divorces as he wants, though he doesn't. King Henry VIII had 6 wives, but only divorced 2. One died of natural causes, one survived the king, and 2 others would perish with their heads in a basket. But while Western Europe grappled with its religious identity, the East and large stretches of Central Europe were faced with a wholly different religious threat. From its strongholds in Asia Minor, the Ottoman Empire had begun its expansion into Europe in 1521. In 1521, Solomon the Magnificent captured Belgrade and conquered most of the kingdoms of Hungary. A few years later, he besieged Vienna but would fail to take the city. This meant that, for now, Ottoman expansion had been halted. In 1539, a 60,000-strong Ottoman army besieged the Spanish garrison at Castelnuovo on the Adriatic coast, forcing the city-state of Venice to agree to a total surrender of its territories in the Aegean and Greece. It's worth noting, however, that the Ottoman presence in Europe wasn't totally unwanted. France united with the Ottomans against their shared enemy of the Habsburgs, and together, the two nations saw great success in the Mediterranean. By 1566, they had a complete monopoly on the eastern Mediterranean, and their empire now stretched over 3 continents. But with this expansion came the horrors and atrocities of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman slave trade was the lifeblood of their empire. Naval raids across European coastal towns were common, with slaves being taken from the French, Dutch, Italian, English, and even Icelandic coastlines before being transported back to the eastern Mediterranean for sale. But perhaps most brutal was the practice of blood tax that came to proliferate across Eastern and Central Europe. Early one morning along the banks of the Adriatic in modern-day Serbia, a young boy hugged his mother goodbye and climbed onto a horse that would take him to the great city of Constantinople, nearly 1,000 kilometers away. Sent by his family as a tribute hostage, the young child was forced to convert from Christianity to Islam, before being impressed into the Ottoman army as part of a formidable and feared elite fighting unit, the Janissaries. His name was Yerj Kastriati Skanderbeg, and over the next 30 years, he would rise through the ranks and become one of the empire's greatest generals. This practice of child levying was common during Ottoman rule of Europe, and while it promised power to second-rate citizens, it also bred contempt. Skanderbeg is best known today for defecting against his Ottoman rulers and leading a 25-year revolt in Serbia against their conquerors. This was not an isolated incident, and many saw the practice of blood taxing as barbaric and brutal, and it directly contributed to the demonization of Islam in the West. Spain in particular took issue with Ottoman expansion, and the two empires would eventually fight a multi-continental religious war against each other as Christianity and Islam faced off once again. But before all this, the Spanish were busy fighting another religious war, not against Muslims or foreign invaders, but against the English king and his new religion, Protestantism. However, this Protestant behavior was abhorred by King Philip II, who viewed himself as a devout Catholic and defender of the faith. On the other hand, Queen Elizabeth I was a Protestant ruler of England who threatened his religious beliefs. So, Philip sent the famous Spanish Armada toward England. It carried with it the banners of the Catholic Church, symbolizing the divine mission it believed it was undertaking. The sailors, soldiers, and commanders saw themselves as soldiers of God, fighting for the preservation and triumph of their Catholic faith. The clash between the Spanish Armada and the English Navy was, in essence, a religious struggle played out on the high seas. It embodied the deep-rooted religious divisions that permeated Europe during that time. Each side believed that they were fighting for territorial dominance and preserving and propagating their respective religious beliefs. As the Spanish were defeated, it was presumed by the British that this was a triumphant call to the Protestant faith. In the early 1600s, European powers embarked on a quest for new lands and riches. The English settled in Jamestown in Virginia, facing challenges but persevering. The Dutch established trading posts in the East Indies, building a powerful trading empire. The French founded Quebec, venturing into the wilderness for fur trading. The Spanish already had successful colonies in South America, creating wealth for their country. Though religious wars weren't over, in 1618, the Catholics and the Protestants were at it again. Emperor Ferdinand II ascended to the head of the Holy Roman Empire, a vast realm composed of diverse territories. His first actions sent shockwaves through the empire, forcing citizens to adhere to Roman Catholicism, even though many of the territories were Protestant. Like the city of Prague, fueled by a sense of injustice, the Bohemian nobility rose against Ferdinand II's religious edicts. The iconic defenestration of Prague unfolded as his representatives were thrown out of a window, symbolizing their rejection of his authority. The defenestration of Prague marked the beginning of the Bohemian Revolt. The primarily Protestant northern Bohemian states sought to break away from the empire, fragmenting an already loosely structured realm. They formed alliances with the Protestant Union states in Germany. At the same time, Ferdinand II sought support from his Catholic nephew, King Philip IV of Spain. Battles erupted across the land, and armies clashed in a brutal struggle for dominance. The conflict expanded beyond the empire's borders, with Ottoman Empire soldiers fighting alongside the Bohemians against the Poles who supported the Habsburgs. To the west, the Spanish army aligned with the Catholic League, a coalition of Catholic nations in present-day Germany, Belgium, and France, who supported Ferdinand II. The initial successes of Ferdinand's forces led to the dissolution of the Protestant Union, causing the scales to tip in favor of the Catholic cause. In 1630, the Kingdom of Sweden was led by the legendary Protestant Gustavus Adolphus. The Swedes pushed back against the Catholic forces and reclaimed lost territory. Under Gustavus Adolphus's leadership, the Protestant victories continued. Yet, tragedy struck when Gustavus Adolphus fell in the Battle of Lutzen in 1632. The Swedes wavered, their resolve shaken. The war ended in a stalemate, with the only decisive fact that 8 million people died in this war. This started to lead many to question the power of this religion. Thinkers like John Locke argued that individuals possessed an inherent right to life. Sir Isaac Newton was discovering gravity and how gravitational force works. Sir Francis Bacon began the process known as the scientific method, a systematic approach to investigating the world. In 1707, the Acts of Union were passed, merging England and Scotland into a single political entity called Great Britain. However, Scotland faced protests and uprisings following the Union, including the Jacobite risings of 1715 and 1745, which sought to restore the Scottish monarchy and independence, though they were both unsuccessful. In 1756, tensions erupted between Austria and Germany over the disputed territory of Silesia, which caused the legendary 7 Years' War. The Austrian Empress Maria Theresa sought to regain control over Silesia, which Germany had seized during the War of the Austrian Succession. In response to the Austrian threat, German Frederick the Great launched a preemptive invasion of Saxony. Frederick's audacious move caught the attention of other European powers. France, seeing an opportunity to weaken its longtime rival Austria, allied with Prussia. On the other side, Russia, Sweden, and eventually Austria formed a coalition against Prussia and its newfound ally, France. The stage was set for a brutal and complex conflict engulfing the continent. Frederick's tactical brilliance allowed him to hold off his adversaries. In the Battle of Zorndorf, he led his forces to a costly victory against the Russians. Despite facing overwhelming odds, Frederick's skillful maneuvering and disciplined troops allowed him to repel multiple coalition offensives. The war raged on, with both sides experiencing victories and setbacks. By 1760, Germany's situation seemed dire, with its territories occupied, its economy strained, and Frederick's forces stretched thin. However, with British subsidies and reinforcements, Frederick managed to turn the tide again. In 1762, the sudden death of Empress Elizabeth of Russia and the ascension of the more sympathetic Catherine II led to a change in Russia's stance. Catherine, desiring to end the war and secure her position as ruler, withdrew Russian forces from the conflict, leaving Prussia to face a weakened coalition. Finally, in 1763, the war ended with the signing of the Treaty of Hubertusburg and the Treaty of Paris. The treaties reaffirmed the status quo ante bellum, restoring most pre-war territorial boundaries. Silesia remained under German control, and Austria, though unable to regain the territory, focused on reorganizing its military and administration. In 1769, Scottish engineer James Watt redefined how to travel by introducing the steam engine. Watt invented a condenser that allowed steam to be condensed in a separate chamber, reducing heat loss and increasing the engine's power and efficiency, kicking off the Industrial Revolution. As the 7 Years' War was ending, the global influence of the Europeans was crumbling. In 1780, José Gabriel Tupac Amaru II led an indigenous uprising against Spanish colonial rule, which was quickly crushed. In 1783, the 13 British colonies revolted from England. The French began their revolution in 1789 as people rose against the monarchy, electing Robespierre as their leader in 1791 in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti. While in 1798, Irish nationalists staged a coup to free themselves against British rule, which failed. People would no longer be content with strict authoritarian European rule. They wanted to rule themselves. This idea of self-governance extended far beyond simple colonialist lines. In Europe, the French Revolution kicked off in 1789 with the storming of the Bastille on the 14th of July. Like their colonial subjects abroad, the people of France were tired of being told what to do by an unelected official who did not appear to represent them or their best interests in the slightest. France's population had boomed since the start of the century, but French institutions were unable to keep up with the demands of their growing populace. A third of all Parisians did not have steady work, and France's ability to grow grain and crops was not enough to feed all the mouths in the cities. Add a highly taxed and overinflated economy, as well as Enlightenment thinking that directly challenged the king's divine right to rule, and you had the perfect conditions for revolution. Beginning with the storming of the Bastille on the 14th of July, 1789, France underwent a period of turbulent change. Aristocrats fled, the homes of tax collectors were burnt, and riots broke out in the streets of Paris. The final blow came when the National Assembly abolished feudalism and adopted the rights of man and of the citizen. The old order was finally gone. The Constitution was adopted on the 3rd of September, 1791. And was meant to symbolize a new France, one where the king had limited power, while an assembly of the people could have a greater say on the running of their country. However, radical members of the newly formed French government wanted to see the king, Louis XVI, brought to trial and punished for his crimes against the French people. On the 10th of August 1792, the French King Louis XVI was arrested by a group of radical insurgents who stormed into his house and took the king as he slept. He was condemned to death on the 21st of January 1793, and his wife, Lady Marie Antoinette, followed just 9 months later. This was the beginning of the most violent and turbulent period of the French Revolution. This was the Reign of Terror. Intended to bolster revolutionary fervor, the Reign of Terror quickly degenerated into a settlement of personal grievances between the revolutionaries. The Legislative Assembly was replaced by the National Convention, which was directly under the control of an extremist Robespierre. Thousands were executed by the infamous guillotine, and the streets of Paris ran red with the blood of previously moderate revolutionaries. The reign continued until Robespierre's own execution on the 28th of July, 1794. By 1795, France had stabilized itself and emerged with a new, moderate national convention. Power lay in the hands of a 5-man directory, appointed by Parliament and supported by the French army. But the directory's rule was unpopular and marred by financial crisis and corruption. Resentment began to fester across France once again, and before long, things were about to reach a boiling point once more. This resentment allowed for the opportunity of a terse man named Napoleon Bonaparte to rise to power. In 1799, amidst the chaos of the post-revolutionary period, Napoleon seized the moment and orchestrated a coup d'etat, catapulting himself into power as first consul of France. Determined to reshape the world, Napoleon embarked on a relentless campaign of conquest. With his grand army, he swept across Europe, leaving a trail of victories in his wake. He shattered old empires and established new ones under his iron rule from Italy to Egypt, Austria to Prussia. His military genius and innovative strategies captivated both his soldiers and his enemies. In 1804, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French, symbolizing his grand ambitions and aspirations for dominance. The Napoleonic era had begun, and Europe trembled before his might. His code of laws, the Napoleonic Code, brought stability and reforms to the territories under his control, leaving a lasting impact on legal systems worldwide. Yet, as Napoleon's empire expanded, so did the forces aligned against him. A coalition of European powers arose, determined to halt his relentless march. The Peninsular War in Spain, the disastrous Russian campaign, and the epic Battle of Waterloo all bore witness to his moments of triumph and eventual downfall. Defeated and exiled to the island of Elba, Napoleon's story seemed to have reached its end. But his indomitable spirit would not be contained. In 1815, he made a daring escape and returned to France for a final bid for power, known as the 100 Days. However, his dreams of glory were shattered at Waterloo, where he suffered a definitive defeat, ending his reign once and for all. Napoleon was exiled again to the remote island of St. Helena, where he died in 1821. As Europe went on, workers poured into the new industrial centers. Villages exploded into significant cities like Lyons, Paris, and London in a few years. In these cities, the masses lived under appalling conditions in crowded slums and damp cellars. Working hours were around 14 hours a day, and the workers were slaves to the rhythm of the machines, as the world was producing more and more steel, silks, and cotton. Rather than being a serf tied down to the land, they were tied down to the machine. During the Berlin Conference of 1884, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck sought to divide the resource-rich and unindustrialized continent to the south, Africa. Britain cast its gaze upon Africa with its mighty navy and thirst for global dominance. The lion's share of the continent fell under its control, as British colonies sprouted like flowers across the landscape. From the gold-rich lands of South Africa to the palm-fringed shores of Nigeria, Britain sought to secure trade routes, protect its strategic interests, and establish settler colonies. Meanwhile, France extended its influence across West Africa with its grandeur and flair. It claimed territories such as Senegal, Ivory Coast, and the vast expanse of Algeria. The French aimed to expand their colonial reach, extracting resources and asserting their cultural influence. Not to be outdone, Belgium's ambitious King Leopold II had a different vision. He coveted the heart of Africa, staking his claim on the Congo Free State. Masked by Christian humanitarian values, King Leopold II exploited the vast resources of the Congo, subjecting its people to unimaginable suffering in his quest for wealth and control. Germany, a rising power hungry for its place in the sun, also set its sights on Africa. It carved out colonies in Namibia, Tanzania, Cameroon, and Togo to bolster its global influence and tap into the continent's natural riches. As for the leaders in the conference, this was just about the money. It wasn't about the cultural exchange, the arbitrary lines they've drawn, or the societies they've divided. The Europeans didn't care about the African lives. The Great War, as it came to be known, had completely reshaped Europe in its entirety. Empires fell, monarchies were overthrown, and Europe marched into the 20th century gripped by a new set of ideals and beliefs. One of these was communism. Made popular by the writings of German philosopher Karl Marx, Marxism promised to rid the world of the suffocating chains of classism, empowering the people and strengthening society through fair, equal, and socialist ideals. One European nation that took these beliefs and ran with them was Russia, who had suffered immensely during the First World War. The people who died in ditches and marched to their deaths on empty stomachs had grown tired of the ruling class's failure to address the real issues which plagued the Russian people. After a series of costly and disastrous military campaigns, Russia capitulated and fell into chaos as her army faced the prospect of a full-scale mutiny. Tsar Nicholas was forced to abdicate from the throne, ending 304 years of Romanov rule in Russia, in the hopes that the people would be appeased following the establishment of the new provisional government. They were not. And before long, Russia was ruled by two political organizations, the Provisional Government and the Soviets. From there, factions began to splinter off, each fighting for control and influence. One of these were the far left-leaning Bolsheviks. Led by the charismatic Vladimir Lenin, they grew in power immensely, promising peace, land, and bread to the starved, downtrodden, and war-weary Russian population. Tensions rose as the Bolsheviks gained power and established their own militia capable of overthrowing the provisional government. On the 7th of October, the Bolsheviks did just that. They launched an armed insurrection in Petrograd and overthrew the provisional government, becoming the first communist leaders of Europe. But while they were popular in urban areas, not all of Russia was as welcoming of their new socialist leaders. After the October Revolution, Russia was plunged into civil war. On one side, the Reds, communists, Bolsheviks, and members of the new Soviet government. On the other, the Whites, liberals, monarchists, and those loyal to the old regime. During this time, Russia underwent serious political and societal changes. Land was confiscated and redistributed amongst the people. The Red Army was established, being made up of loosely organized local militias, and the old Tsar Nicholas and his family were murdered by the very subjects they swore to serve. The Russian Civil War ended in 1923 with a resounding Bolshevik victory. Millions fled the country fearing persecution under the new communist regime, while those who stayed behind quietly buried the 1.5 million dead. A red cloud had ascended over Russia, and in its wake, the USSR was born. The old powers that still ruled Europe looked on in horror, fearful that they might succumb to this revolutionary fervor next. But not every nation was so focused on events abroad. A defeated Germany lay in ruins, pondering its next move. Though in Europe, tension was growing, alliances were being created, and conquest was on anyone's mind. In the summer of 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary embarked on a fateful journey to Sarajevo. Little did he know that his visit would begin an unprecedented cataclysm. Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian nationalist, fired a shot that pierced the heart of the Archduke, setting off a chain of events that would engulf the world in flames, which led to Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia and the beginning of World War I. Russia, the protector of Serbia, mobilized its forces, prompting Germany to declare war on Russia. The war had spread, and it would consume the world. Fueled by a desire for territorial expansion and dominance, Germany turned its gaze westward. In a swift and calculated move, German forces violated the neutrality of Belgium and launched an invasion. This flagrant act of aggression jolted Britain, which guaranteed Belgium's neutrality, which caused Britain to declare war on Germany, setting the stage for a long and brutal conflict. The war swiftly turned into a deadly dance of attrition on the Western Front. Trenches started across the landscape, becoming the bloody home to soldiers from both sides. Months turned into years as they fought tooth and nail, with machine guns rattling, artillery thundering, and poison gas choking the air. While the world's attention was drawn to the Western Front, another theater of war unfolded on the Eastern Front. The forces of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia clashed in a tumultuous series of offensives and counteroffensives. The war's reach extended further, ensnaring the Balkans, Italy, and the Middle East, where the Ottoman Empire had joined forces with the Central Powers. As the war raged on, the tides of fate began to shift. In 1917, Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare pushed the United States, a neutral power, to enter the fray. Fresh troops and abundant resources breathed new life into the Allied cause. Meanwhile, Russia, ravaged by internal revolutions, withdrew from the war, signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. In the summer of 1918, a turning point arrived. The Allies launched a series of offensives that sliced through enemy lines. The Battle of Amiens and the Hundreds Day Offensive marked the beginning of the end for the Central Powers. Germany's military position grew increasingly precarious, and it sought an armistice, ending the fight on the Western Front on November 11, 1918. With the guns finally silenced, the world grappled with the devastating aftermath. The victorious Allies gathered in Versailles to negotiate the terms of peace. The Treaty of Versailles imposed a near-impossible reparations of 132 billion of gold marks, or 500 billion in today's dollars. The German government had to ask themselves, how are they ever going to pay this high fee? The answer? Hyperinflation. The Germans devalued their money to the point of absurdity, where citizens carried wheelbarrows of banknotes to buy a loaf of bread. Unemployment soared, leaving countless families in despair. Dissent and discontent spread like wildfire through the streets, fanning the flames of political polarization. Extreme factions on both the left and the right sought to exploit the Republic's vulnerabilities, promising quick solutions and scapegoats to a desperate population. This economic collapse led to the rise of Adolf Hitler, as the Nazis dismantled the democratic institutions piece by piece. The Republic's story drew to a close. A dark ideology of hatred and totalitarianism eclipsed its ideals of freedom and equality. Hitler blamed one ethnic group, the Jews, for Germany's problems. On the fateful night of November 9, 1938, Hitler showed his hatred for the world during the Kristallnacht, or Night of Broken Glass. Mobs of Nazi supporters and party members took to the streets. They vandalized and destroyed thousands of Jewish-owned properties, including synagogues, schools, homes, and businesses. Jewish-owned stores and establishments were looted, with merchandise stolen or destroyed. But the growth of extremist factions wasn't just a German phenomenon. Nearby Spain was undergoing its own political reform that would lead to the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War in 1936. Fought between the Republicans and the Nationalists, the Spanish Civil War was in many ways a precursor to the Second World War and the ideological battles of the late 20th century. The Republicans were made up of a number of communist, socialist, and anarchist groups who had opposed the old government prior to the outbreak of war. The Nationalists, meanwhile, were made up of an alliance between the conservatives, monarchists, and traditionalists in the country who staunchly opposed the democratically elected Republican government that ruled over Spain prior to 1936. On the 17th of July, nationalist generals Emilio Mola and Francisco Franco launched an uprising aimed at toppling the Spanish government. Despite initial success, they were unable to seize control over any major city, and as such, a bloody civil war broke out that split Spain in two. Franco quickly emerged as the head of the nationalist movement, and with the military support of Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Portugal, he began the siege of Madrid in November, digging in around the outskirts of the city. The Republicans, meanwhile, were receiving aid from the Soviet Union, Mexico, and even France for a short while, as they set up defensive barriers and established guerrilla units to fight the organized nationalist force. Before long, though, many European nations signed a pact of non-intervention with Spain, as they became too preoccupied with the growing tensions in their own countries to become bogged down in a war. But the Republicans were not alone. An estimated 40,000 foreigners traveled to Spain to fight alongside them. Many took direct frontline positions, but medical staff and auxiliary units were also a popular choice that saw many British, French, and Russian faces in their ranks. American writer Ernest Hemingway traveled to Madrid to report firsthand on the fighting and would later pen his famous novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls, about his experiences there. By October of 1937, however, the nationalist cause was gaining momentum. They now held control over all of northern Spain, and by April of the following year, they had driven their army down to the Mediterranean, splitting Madrid from Barcelona and severing the Republican armies in two. In December, Franco's men pushed into Catalonia, forcing an estimated 500,000 Spaniards to flee into France. On the 5th of March 1939, the Spanish government was sent into exile. Just 2 days later, Madrid fell to infighting amongst its Republican factions. Nationalist forces marched into the capital on the 28th of March, completely unopposed, ending the Spanish Civil War. What followed was the establishment of a fascist government in Spain under Franco and his men that would rule until his death in 1975. But before Europe even had a chance to react, their attention was drawn back to Germany and the Führer, who had just crossed the Czechoslovakian border and began his plan for European domination. Hitler wasn't done though. On September 1st, 1939, Germany unleashed its fury upon Poland. Tanks rumbled across the border, planes soared overhead, and Europe was again consumed by the fires of war. Britain and France, bound by honor and duty, declared war on Germany. They vowed to stand against the aggressive forces that sought to plunge the world into darkness. Lines were drawn, and the struggle for freedom began. As the conflict intensified, the flames of war spread like wildfire. In the spring of 1940, the German war machine launched a relentless offensive, swiftly conquering Denmark and Norway. The world watched in horror as the Nazi forces overran France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. Paris, the city of light, fell into enemy hands, and darkness shrouded the land. Across the continent, the Nazi war machine continued its relentless march. The year 1941 witnessed the invasion of the Soviet Union as Hitler's forces unleashed Operation Barbarossa. The vast expanse of the Eastern Front became a battleground where countless lives were lost in a titanic struggle for control. As Europe trembled under the weight of war, the tides of destiny shifted across the seas. On December 7, 1941, Japanese planes destroyed the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, drawing the United States into the conflict. The sleeping giant awakened, vowing to stand alongside its European allies and bring the fight to the Axis powers. The war escalated further, making a dark turning point. The year 1942 witnessed the horrors of the Holocaust as the Nazis implemented their final solution, a systematic genocide of the Jewish people, killing over 20 million people in its wake. In 1943, the war raged on. The Battle of Kursk, a colossal clash of tanks and soldiers, unfolded on the Eastern Front. The Allies made headway, liberating Sicily and Italy from fascist rule, while brave partisans fought a guerrilla war against occupying forces. 1944 brought forth the decisive moment. On the beaches of Normandy, the Allies launched a daring invasion. Codenamed D-Day, it marked the beginning of the end for the Nazi regime. Liberation was in the air as Paris fell into Allied hands, and the people danced in the streets, shaking off the shackles of oppression. Then during 1945, the Soviet forces pushed deeper into German territory, liberating the horrors of Auschwitz and uncovering the true extent of Nazi atrocities. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker as the war's final act played out. The day of reckoning arrived. In May, Germany surrendered unconditionally, and the guns fell silent across Europe. Victory in Europe, known as VE Day, the darkest chapter in European history, had come to an end. Months later, the United States used an atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending the World War for good. As the smoke cleared, leaders and visionaries recognized the urgent need for economic reconstruction. They looked across the Atlantic, where the United States, untouched by the war's devastation, extended a helping hand. The Marshall Plan was unveiled, a great initiative offering financial aid and assistance to war-torn nations, a beacon of hope amidst the destruction. With American support, Europe set forth on a journey of recovery. The wheels of the industry began to turn again. Factories rose from the ruins, and infrastructure projects breathed life into once desolate landscapes. Nations rebuilt their cities brick by brick, beam by beam, each structure a testament to their resilience and determination. But the recovery was not confined to bricks and mortar alone. A spirit of unity and cooperation permeated the air. Leaders recognized that the only way to prevent future conflicts was through collaboration. They sought to unite Europe in a web of common purpose and shared destiny. In 1957, the Treaty of Rome was signed, heralding the birth of the European Economic Community. It was a proactive step towards integration, a commitment to free trade, and a common market. In the quest to build a better society, social welfare systems were put in place. Healthcare and education were expanded, and labor reforms improved the lives of working people. Democratic institutions were strengthened, ensuring that the voices of the people were heard and the mistakes of the past were not repeated. But as is often the case in Europe, the lack of a common enemy meant that old friends were once again foes on the brink of war. Direct American involvement in the region led to one of the biggest ideological conflicts on the continent since the religious reformations of 1517. From 1945 until 1991, Europe was locked in a Cold War. Capitalism versus communism, East versus West, America versus Russia. And for the third time in a century, Europe was to be the battleground. On the 5th of March 1946, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave a speech at Westminster College in Missouri, where he described an iron curtain that has descended across Europe, separating the East from the West. The term symbolized what Churchill saw as efforts by the Soviet Union to block itself off from Western influence and create their own sphere of control within the Eastern Bloc. We now understand that both sides were fighting against the same evil. America had adopted a policy of containment, wanting to stop the spread of communism through financial and military investments across the globe. The Soviets, meanwhile, wanted to stop the spread of capitalism, which they saw as corrupting and detrimental to the communist belief systems of egalitarianism and equality. So a dividing line was established, demarcating the regions of American influence and Soviet influence in Europe. It cut Germany in half, enveloped Czechoslovakia, wrapped Hungary, and snaked down into the Balkans, finally ending at the Black Sea. Germany was the epicenter of this division. Initially split up to be administered between the Allies and the USSR, Germany was violently carved up as tensions between East and West grew, leading to the eventual erection of a physical barrier through its center. Berlin became one of the most militarized capitals on the planet, as East and West came face to face with one another. This division is still seen from space today. Where the West had NATO, the East had the Warsaw Pact. While the West flourished under the riches of capitalism and were allowed independent democratic rule, the East became a series of communist satellite states, answering directly to the Soviets and suffering economically under communist financial policy. Fear, mystery, and distrust flourished as both sides saw the other as a threat to its existence, and Europe hunkered down for a long, cold war. Amidst this blanket of secrecy, the USSR found itself faced with one of the largest ecological disasters of the modern era. It took humanity to the brink of total annihilation, affecting the lives of millions across Europe, and led to the downfall of one of the last empires on the continent. This was the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. On the 26th of April, 1986, Reactor 4 suffered a catastrophic failure after a power surge at the base of the reactor ruptured, destroying cooling components designed to keep the core at a stable temperature. With the radioactive substance now overheating, a steam explosion blew the containment building apart, leading to the total meltdown of Reactor 4 and the expulsion of an untold amount of radioactive energy into the atmosphere. 2 engineers died in the initial blast, while 2 others were rushed to the hospital with acute radiation burns. In the following days, a further 237 workers would be put in hospital following their involvement in the cleanup and stabilization of the plant. Among those hospitalized, 28 died from radiation sickness within the first 3 months of the explosion, while more would perish from radiation complications years down the line. the Soviets went into overdrive, trying not only to control the incident, but also keep it a secret from the rest of the world. A reactor core fired burned for almost 2 weeks, and the Soviets spent an estimated 18 billion rubles, or $68 billion adjusted for inflation, on cleaning up the disaster site. The city of Pripyat and its 49,000 residents had to be evacuated, and the Soviet government established a 30-kilometer exclusion zone to keep people safe. To this day, the exclusion zone has not been lifted. Controversially, while Soviet officials scrambled to take control of the situation, internationally, the government refused to acknowledge the incident had happened at all. In fact, it was only after scientists working at the Forsmark nuclear plant in Sweden detected abnormal levels of radiation in the air that the Soviet government admitted the accident had even taken place. Radiation spilled out into the atmosphere, covering almost all of Europe. Sheep, as far as Wales, were affected. Nuclear rain fell in Belgium and the Netherlands. And the only region in Europe that did not experience any radioactive side effects was the Iberian Peninsula. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster had a profound impact both socially and politically in Europe. A number of European nations decided to phase out their nuclear energy programs entirely, citing too great a risk to the general population. Meanwhile, in Moscow, confidence in the Soviet regime had eroded. Their hesitancy in reporting the meltdown to the global community and the subsequent loss of human life led many in the USSR to question just how important their lives really were to their communist leaders. In fact, the old way of life familiar to so many in communist Europe was about to change forever. For nearly half a century now, East and West had been locked in a state of constant and perpetual warfare. But the Cold War wasn't about troops, weapons, and heavy artillery. This was a war of ideology, fought in the theaters, office blocks, and houses of every person on both sides of the Iron Curtain. By the late 1980s, however, it was becoming apparent to those living under communist rule that the promises of equality, freedom, and economic stability that had been made by the October revolutionaries all those years ago were little more than empty fantasies peddled by a new ruling class. This led to the revolutions of 1989, where a number of Soviet states in the Eastern Bloc of Europe shed the chains of communism and declared themselves free and independent democratic nations. The most famous of these is the fall of the Berlin Wall. East German border guards had been issued strict shoot-to-kill orders against anyone who tried escaping into the West, and by 1989, 140 people had been killed trying to make the dangerous crossing. However, on the 9th of November, things were about to change. A new law was set to come into effect, which would give East Germans greater freedom in traveling between East and West. At 6 p.m., during a Communist Party press conference on the matter, First Secretary of Berlin, Gunter Schabowski, incorrectly told journalists that complete freedom of movement was imminent, and that the Berlin Wall, which had stood for almost half a century, would soon be dismantled as part of a wider disarmament process by the Soviet Union. Schabowski was wrong, and had misinterpreted the note he'd been given by his aide concerning the new law. But journalists left the conference room spreading one message to the people of Berlin: the borders are open. The gates of the wall stand wide open. Crowds gathered at the border demanding they be let through. As Schabowski said, we can. And East German border guards were soon overwhelmed by the sheer number of people. By 10:45 p.m., the guards yielded, opening the gates and allowing East German citizens to cross into the West freely for the first time since 1961. West Germans awaited their countrymen on the other side with flowers and champagne, as families reunited and old friends embraced in what was described by one reporter as one of the most momentous events in the past century. East and West were united once more, and together they climbed the walls which had separated them for so long and began to tear it down brick by brick. The wall would be officially dismantled a year later, and by October of 1990, Germany was reunified once more. Europe realized, like the Greeks against the Persians or like the Romans and the Visigoths against the Huns, that they are stronger if they work together. So in 1992, the Europe-signed Maastricht Treaty was signed, which started the European Union. The European Union was created on the idea that rather than having individual countries like Germany or France make all their decisions, they should be made by a parliament of EU officials in Brussels, allowing for increased trade, more social protections, and a more profound sense of what it means to be European. In 1999, the euro was introduced to replace the individual state's currency with a unified European currency. By 2002, euro coins and bills were introduced, and state currencies were no more. Conclusion: Europe now functions as a united continent, even though in the past they fought to overpower money and religion. Today they are united under the socialistic ideals of free healthcare and free college to make a more equitable place for all. They are striving for the ideal. However, we don't know how it will turn out. History is just the story of the past. Now, we're in the present. Will Europe continue down this path of socialistic pride? Or will it go back to its feudalistic ways of serfdom? Will Europe continue to create great works of art like Michelangelo's David? Or will it continue to go to war like Julius Caesar against the Gauls? Will Europe stay united like the Greeks during the Persian Wars? Or will it turn against one another like Athens and Sparta in the Peloponnesian War? Only time will tell.